Did you know that Dunbar was America's first black public high school? Author Allison Stewart talks about that in her book, Dunbar, America's First Black Public High School.
Allison Stewart is the author of a book called First Class, The Legacy of Dunbar, America's First Black Public High School. It's just interesting that somebody was saying, oh yeah, they're selling books. I can't get black folk to read enough.
Gotta do it.
You got to.
And I gotta tell people, I was telling people that they need to go buy the book, the folks I met in the D.C. area, because I had 10 publishers turn me down for this story.
No.
And
what were their reasons?
Not sure. Lovely story, not sure how you'd write it. Seems interesting, not for
your first
us.
book, I take it.
No, it was my first book, but I've been a journalist for 20 years.
Right,
I've been on MSNBC and NPR, so I was a known entity that way. And the one publisher, Chicago Review Press, an independent, a sizable one, the person who accepted my pitch had been a school teacher, and it resonated with him. And they're out of Chicago, and he said, I've never heard this story, but I'm understanding why this is important. Let's do this. So, I think it's important to send a message that these kind of books can sell, so that more of our stories can be told.
Why is it important for this story to be told about Dunbar High School? Now, let's explain. This is Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. The subtitle is America's First Black Public High School. Now, is that accurate? Was it America's first black public high school?
It wasn't. There were other black high schools, but public high school, meaning the first time that taxpayer dollars and federal funds were used, because after the Civil War, when the Freedmen's Bureau came up, in Washington, D.C., there'd always been free blacks in Washington. There were slaves and free blacks. And in Washington, unlike in the South, it wasn't illegal to teach a black person to read. The local government wasn't going to help you get a school, so there were schools and churches and homes. And Quakers came down from the north. Right. So after the Civil War, there were 3 different acts. It took 3 different laws to get it done to provide taxpayer dollars for public schools for black children. And 3 or 4 D.C. natives saw their window of opportunity. They said, if we're going to try to get a high school, this is when we have to do it. And they slipped through this little window. They got the taxpayer dollars. They had only 4 students. The city did not give them a building, so it was founded in the basement of a church. And they used the money to pay a white teacher initially to come down from the north and teach them.
How long did that aspect of it last?
Interestingly, it was the school. They actually didn't have a school building for 22 years. The high school didn't have a school building. It traveled around, and it was sometimes in some of the grammar schools. It traveled around, and it was in churches. But finally, in 1892, the colored citizens of Washington, D.C., put enough pressure on, and the school was successful enough that they were able to get a high school built, and that was called the M Street School at 128 M Street.
Do you know what's at that location now?
It's like a Head Start program.
Okay.
Yeah, it's nice. The building still stands.
And now how were students selected to go to this new public high school? Now, it didn't start off Paul Laurence Dunbar, did it?
No, it started out as the Preparatory High School for Colored Youth. It was the first name.
All right.
Get that mouthful.
Right.
It was that for the first 22 years. You had to be able to pass a basic test. The first classes, they said, were almost grammar school classes, because they really hadn't had that kind of education as high school, what we think of as a high school education. And in fact, the first 7 classes, they didn't graduate someone for 7 years, because they had students who would go through, and after 2 years they say, okay, you're a teacher now. You're a teacher now.
So these 4 or 10, as they grew, would go through 2 years of quote-unquote high school curriculum.
Yep.
And then they became
teachers.
They became teachers.
And taught the other kids until they could get more experienced teachers into the system. So the first class to actually graduate was in 1877. And then an amazing thing started to happen. Word got out about this high school in D.C., and that it was from the very beginning, once they were able to kind of establish it as a school and get larger numbers, Mary Jane Patterson was the first black woman to get a college degree in this country, and she came and became the principal of this school. As did Richard T. Greener, the first black person to graduate from Harvard, was a principal of this school.
A principal.
Principal. And those people set up the idea that we are going to have an academically rigorous high school.
Okay.
That is what this school is going to be about. This school is about getting black children to colleges. And so what happened was, many of the first to graduate from competitive schools like Oberlin and Amherst and Brown and Yale and Harvard couldn't teach at universities.
Right.
So they came back and taught at this high school.
Yeah.
So you had a very hyper-educated teaching staff.
And this is one of the parts that as I was reading it, and for people who don't understand, and it's funny, we talked to Ernie Green earlier today of the Little Rock Nine.
Sure.
He called in, and he was saying about, he came from a family of educators, and he went to Horace Mann, and they had all the old books, but their teachers were, again, these amazing scholars. And so the advantage that Dunbar High School had was really due to segregation. In a way.
It was one of those an odd thing. It was a making a lemonade out of lemon situation.
Right,
like,
okay.
no, of course, it's not nobody wants to make that leap.
Well, but
you're listening to the best, Joe Madison, the Black Eagle. We're not taking phone calls right now.
And I'd love for you to speak to this, and you do in the book. We were better off when we were segregated.
Yeah.
Because, as you just said, the kids got the best teachers. They got folks who had doctorates from Harvard and Yale who couldn't teach everywhere else. So weren't they better off than they would have been under integration?
Well, a couple of things. One of the things that a lot of the men told me especially is, even though they were in this cocoon, once they left Dunbar and went out into the real world, a world that was hostile to them, it was quite difficult. Many of the men described their experiences going into the armed forces and how poorly they were treated because the armed forces were segregated. And I interviewed Roscoe Brown, and he's, sometimes you have to ask a dumb question as an interviewer. You know the answer already. And I said, so, were you treated better in Europe than you were in the United States? And he said, honey, does the sun come up in the morning? You have they had those kind of experiences. The other thing is, I think we all need to remember, and it was very real to me as I was doing the research, is segregation wasn't about anything except trying to demean people, trying to put people in their place. The results of segregation, if you look at the cover of the book, those kids are packed into that school. The blackboard is cracked. I mean, they were not getting what they needed from the mainstream. And the only way to change that is to get into the mainstream.
Well, and again, the integration of power, resources, responsibility.
You have to be in the room to make the changes.
Right. And I remember reading that quote years ago, because someone asked Dr. King to define integration. He said it's not the mixing of colors, it's really the integration of power, resources, and responsibility. That's what you want to integrate.
Which is interesting, because initially when they wanted to make this school, the founding fathers of the school wanted it to be integrated, as did Senator Charles Sumner, because they understood that if the first schools were integrated, the black students would get what they needed, because the white students were going to get what they needed.
Because everybody's in the same room.
Everybody's in the same room,
So you're not going to give inferior education to the white kid. So that's why once again, you're going to get the same resources and that type of thing. Right?
Yeah. So that socially couldn't happen, and no one would sign off on it. But they would sign off on giving taxpayer dollars to let the blacks start their own
But
schools.
certainly not enough.
Not enough. Oh, there
was
was
close.
And there was also a constant fight to keep this school open and to keep it academically rigorous.
Now, were there public schools in Washington, D.C.?
Yes, there were.
Okay, there were public schools existed, but for white students.
Oh yeah, since 1804.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, they existed. They were for white students almost immediately after the city was founded. They just weren't for black students. The black students would have to find their schooling in the church or in people's homes, and they were private schools, and sometimes they cost money. So if you were poor, or if you were working class, you couldn't afford it. That's what made Dunbar so special. Dunbar has a sort of a cloud over it that it was only for doctors and lawyers' kids and super upper crust
and light skin.
And light skin. And I can tell you,
right.
I can tell you, I've seen the class lists.
Yeah.
We'd be in a lot better. The numbers don't add up that everyone could be a doctor and a lawyer. I mean, honestly, we'd be in a lot better situation if you had 800 kids whose dads were doctors and lawyers.
Yeah. Some people have to be clerks.
There were clerks, there were domestics, there were farriers, there were tailors, there were truck drivers. I mean, it was a very middle class, what we would describe as a middle class environment there.
But when you say middle class, we're talking about black middle class,
yes, black middle class,
which is distinctively different from white middle class. It is,
very much so. And also, black middle class also often means education. They're tied together, I believe. And the other thing that I found interesting was you would find some students who were older in Dunbar, because sometimes you had to drop out to help your family work. So a lot of the young men often had to do that, and they would come back. But the one thing another thing the teachers did that was so amazing in the school is they were wholly invested in the kids, that they would, Anna Julia Cooper, who was this powerhouse principal, would write to colleges and say, I have qualified Negro candidates for you. Come look at my students. And very interestingly, the KIP programs.
Now, what was
KIP
that?
is Knowledge is Power. That's a current group that runs a lot of charter schools, and that's a whole other debate. But one thing that this current group has started to do is they've started having relationships with colleges saying, you'll come look at a few of our students. You don't have to accept them, but you'll come look at them. They're going directly to the admissions officer saying, I have a pool of students you may never even have thought about before. And they've gotten several prominent universities to sign on. So that idea of the educator taking a personal interest and a personal stake and making sure a kid goes from high school, is well prepared, and then can get into a college so they can go farther in life.
What was the curriculum of Dunbar, of the school, from the beginning? And I don't want to, I'm trying not to fast forward, because what was the initial curriculum?
It's very classical education. The kids had Latin, French, Greek, Spanish came later. Geography.
This is the initial stages of the school?
In the initial stage of school was reading, writing, arithmetic. The first 7 years, that kind of stuff.
Okay, all right.
But very quickly, by the 1880s, it was well into geography, world geography, Greek, Latin, French, all of the high mathematics.
With the understanding of what? That they would needed these to get into college? To further their education. Now, your grandfather went to Dunbar?
My grandfather and my parents and my cousin, who I spent yesterday with.
And you went to Dunbar?
I did not.
You did not go to Dunbar?
I'm not from D.C. No. I'm from New York.
That's even more interesting. So how does a person who's from New York, I mean, when were you first made aware of Dunbar High School? Most people don't really, grandparents talk about their high school. I couldn't tell you what high school, if my grandparents even went to high school. I don't think they did, but they were from Mississippi. So what was the discussion like in your house?
Dunbar graduates will talk about Dunbar. That's the one thing, if you talk to children of Dunbar graduates, you grow up hearing about this school. You grew up hearing about how their teachers had PhDs. You grew up hearing about this level of expectation, and that level of expectation is put on you as well. The sense of you were taught, my parents talk about how they were taught to always do their best, be their best, and that they were the best. And that it was their responsibility to get a good education, but the teachers were equally responsible for making sure they got there. So you always heard about them. I heard about them at the dinner table all the time.
So in other words, there was this high expectation from the household to the classroom.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My uncle was a little bit of a rascal, and he used to say that if he got trouble in class, his mother knew about it. My grandmother knew about it before he got home, because the teachers called the parents, or they would go visit the parents.
Or they knew them.
Or they knew them. They went to church with them.
Yeah, they went to church.
They lived in the neighborhoods.
I didn't go to Dunbar here in Washington, but I always tell this story, and we'll take a break and come back, but one of the worst fears I had as a fifth grader was my fifth grade teacher lived in back of us. Mrs. Redmond. Mrs. Redmond lived on the next street over in back of us, and my mother was out in the yard gardening, or grandmother, and Mrs. Redmond was in her yard.
Yeah.
And I don't know what I had done, but Mrs. Redmond said, Mrs. Stone, I need to talk to you about Joseph. I went, oh, God. But that's how,
That's
those were the
like.
days when people, so they all knew each other. Now, I want to take a break because I tell you what, one of the people who's a good friend of mine by marriage and family, his wife, Gwendolyn King, is my cousin, and Cobra King is mentioned in the book.
Yes.
So I'm one of these people. When I grab the book, I start going through the
index
to see who I know.
My publisher told me that was going to happen. He's like, first place to go, the index.
No, I start, I said, oh, Cobra King. But he tells the story, and I'll jump around in the book because we want people to buy the book. But he tells the story about being from Foggy Bottom and going to Dunbar. And let's sort of fast forward. So I'll come back. I'll talk about how it got the name Paul Laurence Dunbar. Yesterday I was at Metropolitan AME, and Reverend Braxton here in Washington, D.C. is so proud of the history of that church, a 175-year-old African Methodist Episcopal church. But they have little gold plates of names of famous people and where they sat.
Oh, wow.
So, and I was sitting right in front of the pew where Paul Laurence Dunbar sat.
Nice.
And they have it, Paul Laurence Dunbar, a member of this church, sat here. And I thought about the interview we were getting ready to do.
I'm surprised how many people don't know who Paul Laurence Dunbar is.
Now, I'm from Dayton, Ohio.
Oh, right on. I went and I stood in Paul Laurence Dunbar's house in Dayton, Ohio
I
Are you really?
Right off of 3rd Street.
Yep.
And it's a shrine to historical site.
Yeah.
And as a growing up in Dayton, that was one of the first field trips that every student took, was to Paul Laurence Dunbar's home.
It's a really
I used
cool
to walk by it every day,
oh, no, my cab driver dropped me off and then said, can I come in with you? I was like, yeah, sure, come on. He had never been in, and he was an older black gentleman. He had just come to the area. I was like, no, you should come in. You should check
we're
this
going to
out.
talk about all of that and Cobra King. So let me take a break, 23 after, a little bit after, and I do want to bring Cobra King in on this.
Please
because
do.
His experiences at Dunbar, and these guys, man, at this, when we were all together talking about Dunbar.
Hey, we'll talk about it.
And this race within the race argument.
Very interesting.
Color-coded.
Yep, there's a whole chapter to it.
See, our white listeners are going, what do you mean color-coded? Well, if you're black, get back. If you're yellow, you're mellow. And if you're white, you're all right kind of color code. We'll continue. Don't go anywhere. Allison Stewart is my guest, the author of this book, The Legacy of Dunbar, America's First Public High School. And I'm going to bring Cobra King on, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, my friend, mentor. I just learned so much from him, and he paid me to say all of that. No, I'm just teasing. So, hey, Colbert, how are you?
I'm fine, Joe. How are you?
I'm doing great. We were all together, and I was telling Allison that we were all together at an event, and I brought up the book, and then, of course, I said you were mentioned in the book. But it's funny, Allison. Let me start with you talked about an article that Cobra King had written.
I did.
About Dunbar, and then we'll bring Cobra in to expand upon it.
Yeah, I have to fess up. Mr. King stood me up from our interview.
Colbert.
Mr. King.
Mr. King.
But that's okay.
He must have been busy.
He was very busy. He was lovely about it. But you know what? I thought that the article, and obviously I watched a lot of YouTube videos and I've read everything that he's written. Not everything, but so much of it. But I thought that the piece that he wrote, The Kings of Foggy Bottom, really helped explain and put in context this idea about Dunbar being only for light-skinned blacks, only for well-to-do blacks. And, it's one of those things where I thought when I was interviewing people I would have to broach the subject kind of carefully. People brought it right up. And there are two different camps. The camp that said it happened every day, all the time, that's the way it was. And then the camp that said, oh, that didn't happen, that didn't really happen. And we all know the truth is somewhere in between. And that's what I think that Mr. King really captured, sort of what the reality of it was, that it of course happened socially. Everybody knows that happens in Washington, but it wasn't what the school was about. It wasn't the reason the school was created or sustained. And, my personal feeling is I think that it is sort of unfair to the school to say that that's what it is.
So I'm going to do you a favor. So if you had to interview Mr. King,
yes.
what was the question you were going to ask him?
Well,
and let's get an answer.
Oh, that would be great.
How's that?
I wanted to know, one of my big questions I asked you was, when was a time in your adult life, either personally or professionally, when you knew that Dunbar had made a difference in your life, that had helped you in some way or had given you the tools that you needed?
I knew going to Dunbar that it would, first of all, Mr. King, your reference to Mr. King, Joe's reference to me as a mentor, but have your listeners believe that I'm on my last leg. I'm on both legs, and they're still shaking, okay?
All right.
Yeah, and so no more Mr. and no more mentor.
Okay.
But I knew going to Dunbar that it was going to make a difference because it had been preached in my head by my mother, who was a Dunbar graduate. And, I knew about her teachers. Some of her teachers were there when I got there. She just praised everything about the school despite her experiences, because we did come from Foggy Bottom, and Foggy Bottom was the in the working class section of the city for African Americans, and it was a difficult time for us economically. On the other hand, she went through that experience. A lot of kids went through that experience. Class was a problem. Race was a problem, but class came first because that's what we dealt with, most of all, our own folks, not the larger white world. We knew where that was, and we knew where the dividing lines were. On the other hand, with us, class found us even in matters of places of worship. You had churches that were tiered according to almost to class. You had schools which most of the teachers attended, and you had schools where a lot of the elevator operators and the janitors and the butlers and the chauffeurs attended. So, churches. And so that was the way it was. But when did I know that we would make it? The day I walked in. This was a place that was going to make a difference. It happened for me, and it also happened for my sister, who was a year ahead.
In terms of the color code, we got into this interesting discussion, even not only in terms of social, but even in the classroom. Did that take place?
There was no separate seating. There's nothing like that.
Okay.
It was more, when I think socially, it was more along the lines of maybe dating, certainly where you went for the weekends, or where you partied on Friday nights, where people spent their summers. We tended not to socialize at parties together, and this was not just according to race, it was more according to class. The kids who attended Banneker then Junior High School, which was across the street from Howard University, were kids whose parents, a lot of their parents taught at Howard, or they were teachers themselves. They were of a professional class, and those kids, they gravitated toward one another on the weekends. You had exceptions, many notable exceptions, especially because of things like athletics. Those of us who played football, the teams went across class lines and social lines. So we tended to function well, and deal with each other on the basis of our ability, not on the basis of our connections and stuff like that. On the non-social side, if I had to say where there was a distinction, it was the way the teachers treated the students. Some teachers, like Bill Rumsey, who was mentioned, Allison mentions in her book, right, who was my real mentor, and the mentor of a lot of young men there at Dunbar, was one who would not be influenced by class, would not let it happen, because he had attended Dunbar. He was a Dunbar graduate, and he also came from a working class background, and he knew what some of us were experiencing at the school in the hands of some of the teachers, and he went just the opposite. He was really egalitarian, and he and he stressed that, and he would not let the class game get played.
My father felt the same thing because my dad did not grow up in D.C. He grew up in Harlem. And when he was about 14 years old, my grandmother picked him up and brought him to Dunbar to go to.
Really?
Yeah, because she said nobody said Joe Stewart in college in the same sentence. And she realized he was smart, and he was hanging out in the street corners,
right.
and was the kind of smart that could get in trouble smart.
Oh, so he went to live with Grandma.
He came down, lived with the grandparents,
right.
and he went to Dunbar, and, you know, he often told me, it was interesting to talk to him, because he often told me exactly what I almost said Mr. King, what Edwin Colbert says about the class thing, because he wasn't an old Washingtonian. He didn't really buy into a lot of the social stuff, and it's interesting when you heard Colbert talk about it. He was talking about the social aspect, and of course that's such an important part for all of us in high school. It wasn't really, like, as he said, they didn't make people sit in different classrooms and everybody got the same sort of teaching and the same education, but the social aspect, which is why I think it's so personal for people, which is why I think people have really hung on to that in terms of describing Dunbar. I just always felt that it was, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that I always felt that it was unfair to hang that around this institution that was really about academic excellence.
Yes, go ahead,
Colbert. That is absolutely true. I mean, it existed, the patterns existed. On the other hand, the stress was the outcome. The principals and the teachers really wanted all of us to succeed. And if you came from the other side of the track, if you demonstrated that you could still handle it, and you were smart, and you would work hard at it, the teachers came around. They didn't see you the same way they saw some of the other kids, but they respected it because academic achievement was important. One of the things that was drilled into our heads is that we were up against the world. They didn't make any bones about that. That we were not just in this thing for ourselves. We were in this thing for a people. It was almost a daily unspoken, but nonetheless very palpable lesson that, look, we have to go do this because we're going to go out into the world and we have to uphold who we are and show that we are not only equal, but we're smarter, and we were carrying a lot on our shoulders. And they didn't make any bones about that. If you're going to be at Dunbar, you're gonna have to carry something on your shoulders. It's more than just getting the A's and B's and getting the letters to wear on your sweaters and things like that. You were representing, and that was just stressed over and over again. You are representing.
You're listening to the best of Joe Madison, the Black Eagle. We're not taking phone calls right now.
In the book, and we're talking to the author, First Class, Legacy of Dunbar, America's first black public high school. Did Dunbar ever integrate?
No.
Never.
No, that's the thing. People always talk about the segregation argument. I said it was black before 1954, and it's always been all black after 1954. But it went become a.
Let me make a little footnote.
It went from being a magnet school to a neighborhood school.
I added in 54. In 1956, we got our first and only white kid.
I should say predominantly. You're right. You're right. I take that back.
Wait.
And there was like one guy in 1969 too.
Really?
Yeah.
By virtue of neighborhood, moving into the neighborhood. Oh, okay.
I think his father was a merchant in the neighborhood, and therefore he attended his neighborhood school. That's where he was assigned, and he was there with us. I think a year, maybe 2 years. But he was there, and he was on the drill team, and he didn't play any sports or anything. He was a average student. I mean, he wasn't a barn burner or anything like that. He was he dispelled the notion of white supremacy. I can say that.
Oh, so funny.
Now, anything else you want to add? Obviously, you've had an opportunity to read the book or review it.
I have.
Anything you want to add, or since you stood Allison up on the interview?
Well, I have to admit, it was a snowy day, and I was coming down, come heck or high water, and I didn't really.
Excuse. No
but
excuse.
I didn't understand. DC shuts down when it snows.
No excuse. No excuse.
My name off the list of people she wanted to talk to. This book is by word of mouth, it's just flying off, around the country. I'm sorry I missed the signing on, was it Friday, Allison?
Yeah, but I'll be at Politics and Prose tonight if you're.
Oh, on Connecticut Avenue?
Yeah.
What time?
7 p.m.
I'll be there.
Oh, fabulous! That's so exciting.
I'll be there. I look forward to it because I have my book and I need it autographed.
Oh, that's great. When I started to sit down and write this book initially, I'm a first-time writer, and sometimes I get in the middle of it. I think, oh gosh, I wish Michael Lewis had gotten this story, or Mark Bowden, one of these amazing nonfiction writers. But I just had such a passion for it. I spent 7 years on it. I quit my job at PBS to finish this book. I just felt, I wrote it from the heart. It's not the most perfectly written book, but it's one that I cared very much about, and I care so much about the story, and I care so much about the legacy of the school and the people who graduated from the school.
Well, you captured it, and you did the school a high honor.
So let me ask, with Colbert, with the final question for you before we take a break. With this national audience that I've got here, people listening in California and all over the country and everywhere in between, they may be saying, well, why is this important to me? I mean, why should I be interested in what happened at Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C.? My mother went to a Dunbar High School in Dayton, Ohio. Is there some similarities, parallels, what?
Yeah, I think that the similarity is that we are still challenged, and as a people, and challenged to achieve against odds. Dunbar not only met the challenge, Dunbar recognized it and made us aware of it and kept us aware of it. Schools need to do that. Schools are not just places where we go and we learn English and math and stuff. Schools have to make sure that we understand the context in which we are performing. Dunbar did that. Dunbar gave us a perspective on ourselves and on the world in which we were going to live, and they prepared us for that. And schools have to convey that same thing to young people.
There's the message in the book for those who are around the country who look at, the sad thing today as we talk about it, and that is today they open up the new school, the brand new school.
$122 million school, yeah.
And, someone broke in last night and stole 3 computers.
It shows you the challenge. One of the things the architect said to me, even though he was very excited, he said, a building can only do so much.
Yes.
A building can only do so much.
That's right. You're absolutely right. And we were saying that, I said that the other day, you now have to take advantage of that edifice. You have to take advantage of that building. And therein lies the challenge that Dunbar has today.
Well, it's our job also to let them know what that building represents.
Right.
And what they did was they desecrated something. They didn't just steal something last night.
Good point.
They desecrated something.
Good point. Yes, good way of putting it. That's a very good way of putting it. You're absolutely right. Cobra King, thank you. It was the last minute. I just kind of wanted to surprise Allison with it.
Well, I'm delighted. And Allison, I'll see you this evening.
Oh, that is fantastic.
All right.
I look forward to it.
Okay, let's take a break. 42 after the hour, we'll continue. And I tell you what I'll do, if you don't mind, maybe we can open up lines.
I'd love it.
There might be Dunbar alum all over the place.
Oh, there are. Trust me.
All over the place. And who knows, and you're welcome to call in 1-866-801-8255, because Dunbar did send out some brilliant people.
And people who literally changed this country. I can tell you more about that.
We'll talk about that when we continue. Don't go anywhere. And they got their start right there. I do like what Cobra King said, and I didn't know how quite to approach the sad news that someone had broken into the school after the open house and I know 3 computers aren't a lot. Thank goodness it was just 3 computers. But Cobra King that's a great choice of words. You just didn't take 3 computers. You desecrated the legacy. Yeah. A legacy. I mean, good point. We'll continue. And again, the book is on our Facebook. The cover's on our Facebook, and I would strongly encourage you educators to get out there and give us a call, 1-866-801-8255. Allison Stewart here. You quit your job at PBS to write this book?
Yeah, I was
stepped out on faith.
I did. I believed in it. You know, I had a few things going on. I had a little kid and some ailing parents, a TV show and a book. I thought to myself, which one of these is not important to your heart? I can get another job.
All right. We'll continue. Don't go anywhere. Allison Stewart is with us. We were just talking, and she was saying she had a child on the way. You give up the PBS job, ailing parents or a family issue, and a new book, and you said, look, I got to do this. I thought Cobra King's point, and your point as well, as to why this book appeals to the rest of the country, because you didn't write this for Washingtonians.
No, there's two reasons that I think this has got a bigger story than just one high school in Washington.
And then I'm going to get to phones. Yeah.
Sure. The first is, you know, when I was digging into the writing of it was when Michelle Rhee came to town to be the chancellor of the D.C. schools, and there was this sort of nationwide focus on education reform. Remember the movie Waiting to Superman came out?
Right.
And I kept thinking, you know, you have a blueprint 3 blocks away in Dunbar. Why isn't anybody looking at what Dunbar was able to accomplish and achieve during a time of social and legal obstacles? And I thought, you know, somebody needs to actually look at this as a model. So that was one of the things I really wanted to make sure that people could understand about what Dunbar was able to do and the things they did there that maybe could be applied. Some of it is common sense, honestly. The other thing is Dunbar graduates truly changed this country. I'm not sure people understand.
Just list some of the folk who are in the book and some who didn't make it in the book.
Sure. There are people who were the first black general in the Army, the first black graduate of the Naval Academy, the first black presidential cabinet member.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
Bob Weaver, HUD.
Bob Weaver, HUD, the first black general.
Benjamin O. Davis.
All right.
And Wesley Brown, first black graduate of the Naval Academy.
All right.
Senator Edward Brooke, first popularly elected black senator.
Okay.
So first federal judge, William Hastings.
Right.
So that's one side. The other side are all the people who went out and went into the legal profession. 2 of the lawyers who argued in the Brown versus Board of Education were Dunbar grads. Charles Hamilton Houston, the great lawyer who was the architect of all-school desegregation as well as housing desegregation, was a Dunbar graduate. The
Dean of Howard Law School and Thurgood Marshall's mentor, yes.
Yeah, the gentleman who is in the Inventors Hall of Fame, Dr. Link Hawkins, who invented all the plastic sheathing that all of our cables, our phone and telephone cables are in. Dr. Herman Branson, who was right by Linus Pauling's side when he discovered the alpha helix, and there are many people who think that he was wrongly left off of all of those science honors. It goes on. Judge Norma Holloway, who was the presiding judge in the Kenneth Starr Bill Clinton hearings. I mean, the list goes on and on. I could stay here for a half an hour and tell you these people, but these are people who changed the fabric of this country, the way we interact with each other, the laws that were made in this country, all came out of this one high school in Washington, D.C.
You're listening to the best of Joe Madison,
James,
the Black Eagle. We're not taking phone calls right now.
With Allison Stewart. Go ahead. James?
Yes, sir. Hey, good morning, Mr. Madison.
Good morning.
I just wanted to say to the author that's in studio, by the way, good morning, young lady.
Yeah, Allison Stewart.
Yes, Miss Stewart. Your energy has kind of put a little spark there to go out and go purchase the book. It's very rare that you get an author that is excited and feel that energy coming through the radio. So I have to say, where can I get the book at? And I'm actually going to listen offline, but I just wanted to tell you I love your energy, your passion, based on what you just put out about your book. So I'm going to listen off air so I can get the information.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. I know Barnes & Noble just got a new shipment. We went into a second printing last week.
Really?
It's been going so well. So barnesandnoble.com has it. And they'll ship quickly.
Congratulations. What have some of the alumni? What have they said about it?
This has been the best part.
Really?
This has been the best. I was at Dunbar a lot last week during the opening ceremonies, and they're so glad that somebody wrote the story down because it really was in danger of being lost. Because I would go to the school in 2006 and I say to kids, do you know who that is in that picture? They had broken picture frames. They didn't know who the people were. Wow. And some of the artifacts were going missing or been thrown out.
That just hurts my heart.
It's hurtful.
It's hurtful.
Yeah.
I mean, to sit there and all the people you have named, like you said, who have just changed the fabric of this country, and to have students walk those halls and not know these people, and they walk the same halls.
And the people who can testify to it are in their 80s and 90s. It became very clear to me.
Wow.
I needed to start interviewing them quickly so that it could be in something permanent. There could be a permanent record of their experience and the school's experience.
Is there a Dunbar Hall of Fame?
There is now. There is now. The new school has a museum in it.
Great.
So that the kids and enough exhibits to keep rotating through, so that there is that sense. And in the new school, physically built into the school are plaques on the floor with the names of the illustrious graduates. And something really nice is they've left several blank to say to the students,
to add your name.
You can be
your
this
name.
person.
Your name.
You could go here.
That's right.
It's cool.
Yeah, your name. Was there any controversy over naming it Paul Laurence Dunbar?
They had to be careful, because D.C. was a political town. That's one thing I learned writing this book, is that D.C. politics around education goes all the way back. So they couldn't name it after Booker T. Washington. They couldn't name it after W.E.B. Du Bois. They'd already taken Sumner and Stevens, the great sort of white congressional leaders who were leading the charge about African-American education. They came upon Paul Laurence Dunbar because of what he stood for. He was sort of the first nationally and internationally recognized black literary figure. Mm-hmm. He was the first person to really give voice to and three dimensions in the black American experience in terms of emotion and intellect. He was an amazing author, and did you see
died at a very young age.
Was an alcoholic. Had a very difficult life.
I think tuberculosis
as well.
Right.
He did you saw The Butler? Yes. Have you seen The Butler yet?
Mm-hmm.
When they start talking about the two faces that the butlers wear, there's
right.
a great poem, and I include it in the book that Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote, called The Mask We Wear.
That's
the
right.
two masks.
Oh, that's right.
And the poem,
Du Bois talked about the two-ness that we all have as African Americans, right?
But the poem of Paul Laurence Dunbar's that has become the school's motto, mantra, a 98-year-old Dunbar graduate can recite it by heart, is a poem called Keep a Pluggin' Away, which is all about no matter what's in front of you, no matter how hard it gets, keep a plugging away. Keep going on. Perseverance is king. No matter how high the hills are, no matter how the ocean roils, just keep plugging away.
See, you're a New Yorker, and let me ask you, were you familiar, I guess because your parents and grandparents, so you knew Paul Laurence Dunbar, the history, because here's what I was thinking about. There are two poets, great poets, that we had to read, Langston Hughes and Paul Laurence Dunbar.
And we had Phyllis Wheatley. My parents used to tell me.
See, we didn't get into Phyllis Wheatley so much, but certainly Paul Laurence Dunbar and Langston Hughes.
Yeah, that's sort of part of about knowing your history.
Yeah.
I mean, wasn't it Marcus Garvey who said, people that don't know their, I'm paraphrasing, origin, history, or culture is like a tree without roots. Right. And I think it's really important also in a bigger picture why I wanted to write this book is I wanted people to understand the contributions that African Americans have made to this country.
Right.
If you're I'm 47, so in my vintage, you learned, slavery, and then you learned 1954, and you learned 1968. That's what you learned about black history in this country.
That's why, I got to tell you, you'd appreciate the fact, that's why at the beginning of every hour, we start with a black history fact.
I loved it. I heard it.
Every hour. And just so that I didn't know this artist. I didn't know that inventor. And hopefully you'll go out and go to a search engine, Google it or whatever, research it, maybe find a book. And like you can find this book, First Class, Legacy of Dunbar, America's first black public school. So great book, and you'll get a chance to see Colbert King and maybe have a few more questions for him.
Very excited.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Allison Stewart, for coming in. And please, people, teachers particularly, let me encourage teachers, students, administrators, parents.
Yeah.
Because that's what was, and for you new folk over at the new Dunbar High School, keep the legacy alive.
Keep a plugging away.
Keep a plugging away, as Paul Laurence Dunbar would say.